The ultimate freelancer. You asked me for an article on whatever I wanted to write about. And since you don't pay, I figure that gives me carte blanche. I started out tonight on an incoherent bitch about the record business. I was looking at the jacket copy on the Blues Project album, but the producer's name was in huge script on the back, and underneath it were 4 or 5 other names, punks and narcs and other 10%ers who apparently had more leverage than the musicians who made the album and so managed to get their names on the record jacket. I was brooding about this, which I'll write about sometime later, when I picked up the latest Free Press and read an obituary for a 3-year-old kid named Gadot, which was nice. But as I read it, I was reminded again of Lionel Allais and how the Free Press commemorated his death with a small block of unsold advertising space that had to be used anyway. So why not for Lionel? I'm also reminded that I've asked you twice for a copy of his article on Lenny Bruce, in which Lionel wrote his own obituary, and that you've disregarded both queries. Maybe there's no connection between this and the fact that the Blues Project people were fucked out of any mention except photos on their own album. But I think there is. I see it as 2 more good examples of the cheap, mean, grinning hippie capitalism that pervades the whole new scene. A scene which provides the underground press syndicate most of its income and copy. Frank Zappa's comments on rock joints and light shows, FP 1230, was a welcome piece of heresy in an atmosphere that is already rigid with pre-public senility. The concept of the UPS is too right to argue with, but the reality is something else. As Zappa indicated, if only in a roundabout way, there are a lot of people trying to stay alive and working within the UPS spectrum, and not on the 10% fringes. That's where Time Magazine lives, way out there, on the puzzled, masturbating edge, peering through the keyhole, and selling what they see to the big wide world of Chamber of Commerce voyeurs who support the public prints.
Which brings us back to Lionel, who lived and died as walking proof that all heads exist alone and at their own risk. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe his funeral procession on the Sunset Strip was enough to bring even cops to their knees. But since I didn't hear anything about that action, I have to doubt it. I suspect Lionel died pretty much as he lived, as a freelance writer, hustler, grass runner, and general free spirit. I'm sure a lot of people do it better than I did, but I think I do it pretty well. I first met him at Big Sur in 1960 when we were both broke and grubbing for rent money. After that, we did a lot of writing back and forth, but we'd only meet, usually at the hot springs at Big Sur, after long months of different action in very different worlds. He was broke somewhere in New England when I was in Peru, and later in Rio, I got a letter from him with a Chicago postmark. When I got back to New York, he wrote from LA saying he decided to settle there because it was the only home we had. I've never been sure if he included me in that definition, but I know he was talking about a lot of people beyond himself and his wife, Beverly. Lionel saw the West Coast of the 1960s as Malcolm Cowley saw New York after World War I, as the homeland of the uprooted. He saw his own orbit as something that included Topanga, Big Sur, Tijuana, the Strip, and occasional runs up north to the Bay Area. He wrote for Cavalier and the Free Press and anyone who would send him a check. When the checks didn't come, he ran grass to New York and paid his rent with LSD. And when he had something that needed a long run of writing time, he would take off in his Porsche or his Plymouth or any one of a dozen other cars that came his way, and a cadge a room from Mike Murphy at Hot Springs or at Brother Dennis's house across the canyon. Lionel and Dennis were old friends, but Lionel knew too much and insisted on saying it, to use that friendly leverage as a wedge to the screenwriting business where Dennis Murphy was making it big. Lionel had already published 2 novels, and he was a far better plot maker than most of the Hollywood hacks. But every time he got a shot at the big cop-out money, he blew it with a vengeance. Now and then, one of the New York editors would give him enough leeway to write what he wanted, and a few of his articles are gems. He did one for Cavalier on the soul of San Francisco that is probably the best thing ever written on that lovely, gutless town. Later, he wrote a profile on Lenny Bruce for the Free Press that, if I ran a newspaper, I'd reprint every year in bold-faced type as an epitaph for freelancers everywhere.
Lionel was the ultimate freelancer. In the nearly 10 years I knew him, the only steady work he did was as a columnist for the Monterey Herald. And even then he wrote on his own terms, on his own subjects, and was inevitably fired. Less than a year before he died, his willful ignorance of literary politics led him to blow a very rich assignment from Life magazine, which asked him for a profile on Marty Ranzahoff, a big-name Hollywood producer, then fresh from a gold-plated bomb called the Sandpiper. Lionel went to London with Ranzahoff, first cabin all the way, as he wrote me from the SS United States. And after 2 months in the great man's company, he went back to Topanga and wrote a piece that resembled nothing so much as McKenken's brutal obituary on William Jennings Bryan. Ranzahoff was described as a pompous toad, which was not exactly what life was looking for. The article naturally bombed, and Lionel was back on the bricks, where he'd spent the last half of his 40-odd years. I'm not sure how old he was when he died, but it wasn't much over 40. According to Beverly, he suffered a mild stroke that sent him to the hospital, and then a serious stroke that finished him. Word of his death was a shock to me, but not particularly surprising, since I'd called him a week or so before and heard from Beverly that he was right on the edge. More than anything else, it came as a harsh confirmation of the ethic that Lionel had always lived, but never talked about. The dead-end loneliness of a man who makes his own rules. Like his Basque anarchist father in Chicago, he died without making much of a dent. I don't even know where he's buried, but what the hell. The important thing is where he lived.
We got Velp coming.
Look at that shit. That's fucking... Oh, man. Biblical.
Yeah.
Biblical freedom.